Welcome to our show today, The Home Care Companion. I am Dawn Benninghove, registered nurse, owner of Companion Extraordinaire Home Care, and your host for today. Our guest is Kim Hendrickson Leffler. And Kim, we are so excited to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Dawn. I'm delighted to be here.
My goodness, when I look at your educational background and the jobs that you've done over the years, it's been pretty incredible with your career. You have held positions as a reporter for the Detroit News, a radio television writer-producer for J. Walter Thompson and BBDO, Deputy Director of Hanover County Department of Economic Development, and also retired from the American Red Cross as a volunteer services specialist. You've written an amazing book, A Turn for the Better, and we're excited to hear about that today.
I've enjoyed working with you over the years in several different capacities, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about a book that I understand is helping your patients.
Absolutely. I think it's pretty incredible that it was your dad that you created this book. It was through the things that you went through with him that helped you be able to write this book. And I'd like to take just a moment, if I might, if that was okay, and tell our listeners about your dad, because he truly, truly was an amazing man. He was a journalist himself, so I believe you got that naturally, it seems like.
Yes.
Advertising executive for General Motors and a professor at Michigan State University. The thing that stands out so much for me, though, is also that he was a World War II veteran and was awarded the Purple Heart. What an amazing person to be able to have you come along. You know, I've been a daughter in that position, and it wasn't always easy. So tell us, this book was born out of those times with him, correct?
That's right. He was truly the best man I've ever known. And he had an incredibly wonderful nature. He was sweet. He was incredibly intelligent. He literally had an IQ off the charts. But he was the nicest person anybody ever has known. And that's something that everybody who knew him will tell you. He was the nicest man they've ever known. So when he started developing symptoms that were troubling to my mother, things where he was not remembering and couldn't pull words out that were meaningful, she was really troubled by that. And yet she was reluctant to talk about it, because to her, anything wrong with my dad's brain meant mental illness. She was not willing to acknowledge Alzheimer's. And of course, this was early in the days of Alzheimer's diagnoses. People understood senility, but Alzheimer's was fairly new. So I lived 600 miles away from my parents and didn't see them often, but I talked to them all the time. And my mother began telling me about issues with my dad, and I began going up there. Every 3 months, I'd stay for a week, and I began to see the things that were troubling to her. My 3 brothers who lived nearby didn't see these issues with my dad because they saw my dad for Sundays and you know, occasionally during the week, and he could pull it off. But in the evenings, that's when we started noticing issues with what's called sundowning. And eventually that turned into anger. And that turns out to be something that is very common with patients with Alzheimer's, because they begin to lose a sense of what's around them, and they see shadowy figures. They don't know what's happening, and they're frightened, so they tend to lash out. And this was really troubling to my mother, particularly, who was in her 70s as well. And when my dad got angry and was trying to defend himself, as he saw it, he would hit out. And if my mother tried to go in and give a hug to her husband of 62 years, he would hit her, not meaning to hurt her, obviously, but just trying to defend himself against the unknown. And this was troubling to me, especially. And I thought there must be something we can do about that. He had been given some medication for it, which was completely wrong. But I was able to get him off that medication. But Mother listened to me and got Dad diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So at least we knew what we were dealing with.
So I certainly understand, Kim, how distressing this was for you and for your mom and for your entire family, because as you said at the beginning, your dad was such an incredibly good-natured person. But I know as a registered nurse, I see this with our clients as well, that does happen. And so often families just react as opposed to knowing exactly what to do. And so one of the things that with him being in his mid-70s, your mom being in her mid-70s, and this sort of increased forgetfulness and starting of the anger outbursts, I know that your book was truly born out of that. One of the key phrases that you use in your book is you wanted to improve his mood. Improving his mood was like one of the real keys. And regimen was the other word that you used in the book. So improving a mood and a regimen. And one of the first things that I noticed was singing, that he loved singing. And of course, I grew up in a singing household, and you mentioned Chattanooga Choo Choo, and I can sing every verse to that. So tell us a little bit about how that regimen and improving his mood began to unfold.
It was really important to find ways that could help my dad feel perhaps a little more in control and be in a happier mood. And the singing, we knew that Dad loved to sing. He grew up in the big band era. He knew all the words to all the big bands. He might not be able to tell you what happened this morning or what he'd had for breakfast, but boy, he could tell you every single word of every lyric of every song, to which he had been a phenomenal jitterbugger back in the day. So I discovered that if I turned the music on, and thank heavens, the TV stations these days allow you to go to music choice, and we found one that played big band music 24 hours a day. And when we turned that music on, suddenly Dad's mood got better. Suddenly he was smiling. He was transported back to a time in his life when he was a young, healthy, vigorous man in the prime of life, and mentally that's where he went again. And emotionally, that's where he went again. So we found that we could definitely change his mood by encouraging him to sing, to dance, to hear that music. It just transformed things. The other thing was the regimen that you discussed. He had to have a standard practice of doing things every day. That worked best for us, and it really worked for him. To get up at the same time, to have his medication at the same time, and that was vital. To eat his meals at the same time, to get regular exercise. We couldn't just let it go. We had to control things. He could not control them, so we had to control them for him. And finding out the things that worked was a process, but we pulled it off.
That's a great way to put it, Kim, that he just didn't know and couldn't come up with what was best for him at the time. I'm sure he seems still very much in control, as you state in your book, that if you didn't know him, he could appear as if there was no Alzheimer's dementia. And so it's so hard to want to say, I just know this is best for you, and yet you know that it is a difficult thing often because the person with Alzheimer's doesn't understand that, and they want to keep their control.
Exactly.
So in that regimen, in addition to singing, you talk about sunlight and seasonal affective disorder, which right now in the winter months, that really does have a role that it plays with patients with dementia. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, Dad was 100% Swedish. And the Swedes are known for being affected by seasonal affective disorder. It's just part of their nature. And so I'm prone to that myself. I need sunlight. I need brightness, particularly during these winter months. And Dad was really affected by that. It transitioned into a condition known as sundowning for him. And literally, it gets its name because as the sunlight disappears, people begin to get depressed and moody and low in spirits and so forth. And people with SAD, seasonal affective disorder, can feel this all day long, not necessarily when the sun goes down, but for my dad, if it was dark, if it were getting dark, if it were gloomy, he would be sundowning, and he would act as though the world had fallen apart. He was never going to be happy again. And that's when I discovered that if we opened the windows, if my mother had the curtain closed and the house was gloomy, if we opened the windows, let the sunshine in, that helped. Getting him into a hot shower cheered him up immediately. A good hot cup of coffee. I'll never forget. Every time my dad was appearing to be down in the dumps, all we had to do was say, "Dad, would you like a cup of coffee?" And he'd say, "Coffee? Yes, absolutely. Let's have a cup of coffee." And that could be midnight. It could be, 2 in the morning. It could be 3 in the afternoon. It didn't matter. He lit up at the idea of coffee. So immediately we encouraged that. So we'd open the windows. We'd turn on lights. If we didn't have sunlight, we'd make sunlight by turning on the overhead lights. We had coffee going all the time. We had hot showers. We had the 24-hour big band sound. We did everything that we could to alleviate his mood. And these were things that you and I, Dawn, if we're feeling down in the dumps, we know that if we take a brisk walk, read a good book, light a candle, something like that, that's going to cheer us up. Alzheimer's patients can't do that for themselves. They've forgotten how to make it right. And it really is dependent on the caregiver to do that.
You are so right. I remember we, a few weeks ago, had Mary Ann Johnson, previous director of the Alzheimer's Association, on one of our podcasts. And Mary Ann taught me one time that we really need to go where they are, and that when we've seen one person with Alzheimer's dementia, we've seen that one person. And so finding out what worked for him. In your book, you talk about invigorating beverages, and I love that because it's different for each of us as to what really invigorates us. For me, it's going to be a cup of tea or a cup of hot cocoa. I don't like the marshmallows, but it makes you just makes you feel so well inside. And you're right, that's what we do to be able to do that. But for you all, I mean, people may be listening and think, "Oh my gosh, who would give your dad coffee at 3 o'clock in the morning?" But you go into this in more detail, and it's not that you gave coffee, you gave that decaf or a little bit of half or whatever it might be, because it was the taste as opposed so much as the caffeine. Is that correct?
Exactly. It was. Although, honestly, my dad could drink full strength coffee, and it would not affect his ability to sleep. But for him, it was the idea of coffee. The idea of a hot cup of coffee was something that just made him feel good. So we would offer that, and that just cheered him up. It didn't always work, and so we had to try some other things too to get him out of the anger. Coffee worked for getting out of sundowning, but anger was often a whole different matter.
Did the hearing come into play with the anger?
To a certain extent, it did. Dad wore hearing aids. He was a gunner in a tank in World War II, so that had a dramatic effect on his hearing, although he didn't start wearing hearing aids until later in life. But not being able to hear definitely contributed to the issues about anger, because if he couldn't hear, if he heard strange sounds, or if he wasn't able to identify what was going on, that was difficult. And we couldn't put his hearing aids in for him. So, we had to hope that he could do it himself, which he generally could, but it definitely contributed.
Again, that's a great thing to pick up on, because sometimes we don't think about that. Even just a battery being low inside of a hearing aid can make a huge difference, or wax inside of ears. Again, we don't check for that very often, and that is something else that we should look at. So, yes, those are wonderful, wonderful things. Now, exercise and activity. I know that's something special you and your dad did together a little bit. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And in fact, I really give a lot of credit to my mother, who, well before she understood what was going on, recognized that my dad always felt better after a good long walk. And my dad was one who loved to take walks. And they lived in a neighborhood that was kind of contained, so he could go out and walk by himself for long periods, and she encouraged that, and that fresh air and vigorous exercise really made a difference. Dad and I would go walking together every chance that we got, and eventually he and my mom came down to live with my husband and me, so we were able to spend 24 hours a day over long periods with him. And this was just great. Sometimes he had to be encouraged to get up out of his chair if he were in a blue mood. But hey, Dad, let's put on our jackets and go out for a walk. And generally speaking, he would go along with it. Once he got outside, he was always feeling better. Another thing that my dad loved to do was rake leaves. And that was a really useful activity because where we lived, we had lots of trees and plenty of leaves. And all we had to do was put a rake in Dad's hand, and he would be content for hours raking up leaves. So it was, everybody is different. Some people prefer to ride bicycles. Some people like to walk the dog. Whatever it is, I strongly encourage anybody who is dealing with someone with Alzheimer's or any kind of dementia to figure out what that exercise regimen is and practice it.
And it doesn't even matter if the leaves get done right as to what we think right is.
Right.
It's the fact that he's enjoying it, he's having exercise, and even if he were to get to that place where he couldn't do leaves inside, you might even be able to cut the handle of the rake in half, and you might be able to bring some things in that he could rake like on the floor. I know we've done that when our patients have then been confined to a wheelchair to try and continue to do that activity, even though it's at a little lower pace and a little lower scale. It still makes a difference, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And you bring up a very excellent point, Dawn, that each person is individual, and it really requires input from the people who know that person best to identify the things that are going to work for that person. It is not a one-size-fits-all. There are certain commonalities in Alzheimer's, but every individual has unique needs and unique buttons to push, if you will.
Yeah, so let's talk about that uniqueness for your dad, because I was really thrilled when I read the book to talk about the aromatherapy, eye contact, choosing movies wisely, and hypnosis.
Yeah.
These are things that, until I experienced them with some of our clients, especially the choosing movies wisely, I don't think we all think of very readily. So what's your take with your dad on the aromatherapy and the eye contact especially?
Aromatherapy was interesting. I had heard that there were 12 common scents, banana oil, eucalyptus, things like that, that if you were unable to smell those, that was an indication that you might be developing Alzheimer's. And the first time I became aware of this from my dad was that we were out walking, and there was a flower that was in full bloom at that point. You could smell it everywhere. And I said, Dad, oh, it's honeysuckle. I said, Dad, isn't that wonderful? Can you smell that honeysuckle? He said, no. And I thought, whoa, why not? Dad can't. So I did a little research, really looked at that link between the loss of smell and the onset of Alzheimer's. And I thought, maybe this can be reversed. Who knows? I mean, it's worth a try. So I put a eucalyptus oil. I found the strongest thing I could find that had a very heavy scent to it. And I saturated a cotton ball with it, put it in a little Dixie cup, and held it up to my dad's nose. And it took a little while of him working at it. But eventually he began to smell it. And we noticed that his mind was functioning a little better when we did these therapy sessions. But I couldn't go around holding a Dixie cup under Dad's nose all the time. So I thought, well, what's the next best thing we can do? How can we get a fragrance under his nose that's going to constantly stimulate him? And there are aromatherapy oils that you can burn and so forth. But my dad is a man, and men go through rituals which include shaving and slapping on aftershave. Well, Dad was still shaving. In fact, using a shaver was one of the most important things in his daily routine. I got him the strongest smelling aftershave I could lay my hands on and encouraged him to slap it on his face every day after he shaved. And that stayed, that lingered under his nose. He was smelling that for hours at a time. And I think it had a dramatic effect on his mental acuity because we saw that he was doing better. You asked about the eye contact. When Dad was living with us, Mom and Dad were living with us, we sat at a table with my husband opposite me and my mom and dad opposite each other. Well, my mother was having no issues with dementia at that point. She did develop some symptoms later, but not then. And she was a very engaging person to talk to. So Ray and I found that we were talking to Mom. Well, turning and talking to my mother meant we were turning our backs on my dad, who was sitting on his side of the table alone, not involved in the conversation. He couldn't keep up with the conversation, and we weren't making eye contact with him. So eventually, we'd notice that he was just sitting there, sometimes not even eating, and his head would begin to droop, and he was definitely getting unhappy. And I thought, well, this is not right. We need to include Dad in the conversations. So I changed our arrangements, and I put my dad sitting next to my mom at the table. That meant even if we were just talking to my mother, we were still looking at my dad when we looked at my mom because Dad was sitting right next to Mom. So he was part of the conversation. We were making eye contact with him. We weren't turning our backs to him in order to talk to my mother. And that made a huge difference. We also encouraged him to be a little bit more involved in the conversation. My mom would turn to him and say, Jack, what do you think about that? And maybe he couldn't even contribute to it, but he was right there next to her, and she was engaging him. She could reach over and touch his hand, and it was huge. It made an enormous difference in his attitude.
That is so wonderful because I think we often do leave people with Alzheimer's dementia out of a conversation because sometimes what they do answer doesn't make sense or sometimes it just isn't correct, but it really doesn't matter. It's the fact that they're involved is what's important.
They're still a valuable human being and a major part of your family.
Yes, absolutely. And choosing the right movies, I know for me, I was actually with a client one time and we were watching Hallmark, which you would think would be safe. But the patient began to become very argumentative. And all of a sudden I realized that what was on TV is that the couple on TV was having an argument. And I then knew we were in that Hallmark movie. And it was such an eye-opener for me at that moment. So I did the exact same thing as you talk about in your book, where from then on we were very careful about what movies, even if it's a Hallmark and you think that's going to be okay. But if you would, take a moment and talk about hypnosis, because that is pretty grand where your father was concerned.
Yeah. That was an inspiration on my part. My dad was exhibiting anger, particularly associated with sundowning, and it was terrifying because, as I mentioned earlier, my mother would try to go in and calm him down, and he would lash out at her, not at her, but at this unknown person who was approaching him in the dusk, and it was really troubling. My husband, who was bigger than my dad, was the only person who could go in and try to stop him from defending himself and hurting anybody. So this couldn't go on. And it just occurred to me, I'm not even sure what triggered it, but I thought if we could somehow manage to hypnotize my dad to respond to a word that would immediately stop his anger and switch his mood, because we couldn't do it ourselves. It had to come from inside him, and the only way it could go inside him was to hypnotize him. If you could hypnotize people into not smoking or weight loss or whatever, maybe there was something that could be done locally. So I looked around for local hypnotherapists, and I found a wonderful practitioner who is a licensed psychologist who practices hypnotherapy as part of his practice, named Dr. Robert Petrie in the Richmond area. And I told him over the phone what it was I was trying to do, to see if we could hypnotize my dad into responding to a word or a phrase or something that would stop his anger and transfer his mood. And he said, I've never done anything like that before, but I'm willing to give it a try. So my dad and mom and I drove over to his office one day. I didn't even know if my dad was suggestible. We had no idea if this was going to work. But he was suggestible. And it wasn't a matter of the doctor holding up a spinning watch or anything like that. He just very calmly talked my dad into relaxing and letting go. And then he got my dad to associate the word smile with a mood change. He asked my dad to smile. And then he asked my dad what happened when he smiled. And Dad said, well, the corners of my mouth go up, my cheekbones go up. So there were physical associations with that word smile. And the doctor got it to the point where all we had to do whenever Dad got angry was to say, smile, Dad, and Dad had to smile. That word associated the physical movements with him. And so we'd say smile, and immediately his cheekbones would go up, the corners of his mouth would go up, his eyes would close just a little bit the way they do when you're smiling, and his anger went away instantly. It was phenomenal, and it wasn't just me or my mom or my husband who could say that. Anybody could say smile to Dad, and it instantly transformed him. It was life-changing. It was a truly wonderful inspiration on my part to try that.
Well, Kim, I can't thank you enough for thinking outside the box and forging the territory for those of us, coming after you, and for writing this amazing book, A Turn for the Better. I know I heard that you were looking at a re-release on that. And I know if our listeners might like to be able to get a copy of that, is there a place that they can do that at this moment, Kim?
Yes, anybody who would like a copy of the book could get in touch with me at my email, kimleffler @outlook.com. That's KIMLEFFLER @outlook.com.
Wonderful. And I would really highly, highly recommend. I know we're now using your book in our training program for our aides with training them on dementia. And it's incredible.
Oh, thank you.
Kim, I'd like to end today by actually reading the dedication to your book. It was so powerful and so moving and actually brought me to tears when I read the book. This book is dedicated to my father, whose lifelong bravery and courage are exemplified in his current struggle with dementia. His absolute determination not to give in or give up continues to set a shining example for his children and grandchildren. And to my mother, whose devotion to my father is unparalleled. Her spirit glows with grace and dignity. I am honored to claim her as my own. Kim, I am honored to have you as a guest today and for forging the path that so many of us are able to take as well. Thank you so much. Words do not speak loudly enough for what you have given us through the work you've done with your parents.
Oh, thank you, Dawn. Thank you very much.
So thank you all for listening today. We really appreciate having Kim Hendrickson Leffler here today and want to thank you all for listening. I am Dawn Benninghove, your host for the Home Care Companion. We hope we have added another tool for your toolbox today. And for more information about Companion Extraordinaire Home Care Services, you can visit our website at www.cenninc.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcasts, downloaded straight to your device each week.